Start of video 3. National Security Council, NSC. The National Security Council, NSC, was established by statute to support the President in developing and implementing national security policy by coordinating across relevant departments and agencies, integrating authorities and resources toward common ends, and objectively assessing progress toward established goals. Led by the National Security Advisor, NSA, the NSC staff will be successful in implementing the President's national security goals only if it is made up of personnel with technical expertise and experience as well as an alignment to the President's declared national security policy priorities. The NSC must then chart a course that articulates and achieves the President's national security goals and objectives. The President should empower a strong NSC that not only has the power to convene the policy process, but also is entrusted with the full power of the Presidency to drive the bureaucracy. In organizing, by means of Presidential Directive 31, an NSC staff that is more responsive and aligned with the President's goals and empowered to implement them. The NSA should immediately evaluate and eliminate directorates that are not aligned with the President's agenda and replace them with new directorates as appropriate that can drive implementation of the President's signature national security priorities. In addition to realigning the staff organization to the President's priorities, the NSA should assign responsibility for implementation of specific policy initiatives to senior NSC officials from across the NSC staff structure. These officials should develop, direct, and execute tangible action plans in coordination with multiple agencies to achieve measurable, time-defined milestones. Aligning NSC staff to the President's national security goals will provide clearer direction, a mandate for action, and a baseline of accountability that can be used to evaluate staff performance and the NSC's overall progress. Accountable senior officials, themselves either political appointees or a minimum number of career detailees, who are selected and vetted politically and report directly to political staff, should be the main day-to-day managers for interagency coordination and implementation of their assigned national security policy objectives. They should provide policy analysis for consideration by the broader NSC and relevant agencies and ensure timely responses to decisions made by the President. The accountable senior officials should be established at the direction of the NSA and draw on personnel and expertise from beyond the NSC, including OMB, the National Economic Council, and relevant federal agencies. The NSC staff and principals should work in tandem with the National Economic Council and OMB at all levels, presenting a united effort to achieve the President's goals and drawing on the latter's statutory authorities to guide the bureaucracy. To accomplish national objectives effectively, foreign policy should fully incorporate the economic instruments of national power. National security policy must also include the prioritized allocation of resources. When policies are divorced from the resources required to implement them, they are stillborn, academic exercises that undermine our national security and leave departments and agencies to their own devices. The accountable senior officials should be empowered to identify, recruit, clear, and hire staff who are aligned with and willing to shepherd the President's national security priorities. NSC staff leads, under the direction of the NSA, should have the discretion to reduce the number of positions that need high-level clearances, and the NSC should be adequately resourced and authorized to adjudicate and hold security clearances internally with investigators who work directly for the NSC and whose sole task is to clear NSC officials. If certain staff are determined not to need high-level clearances, the question becomes whether they should be part of the NSC at all. The NSC should take a leading role in directing the drafting and thorough review of all formal strategies, the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, the Missile Defense Strategy, etc. In particular, the National Defense Strategy, which by tradition has evaded significant review, should be prioritized for White House review by the NSC and OMB. Both should also conduct reviews of operational war plans and global force planning and allocations with the Secretary of Defense to align them with presidential priorities and review all key policy and guidance intended for implementation by the heads of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the intelligence community before they are authorized for distribution. The NSC should rigorously review all general and flag officer promotions to prioritize the core roles and responsibilities of the military over social engineering and non-defense matters, including climate change, critical race theory, manufactured extremism, and other polarizing policies that weaken our armed forces and discourage our nation's finest men and women from enlisting to serve in defense of our liberty. The NSC staff will need to consolidate the functions of both the NSC and the Homeland Security Council, HSC, incorporate the recently established Office of the National Cyber Director, and evaluate the required regional and functional directorates. Given the aforementioned prerequisites, the NSC should be properly resourced with sufficient policy professionals, and the NSA should prioritize staffing the vast majority of NSC directorates with aligned political appointees and trusted career officials. For instance, the NSA should return all non-essential detailees to their home agencies on their first day in office so that the new administration can proceed efficiently without the personnel landmines left by the previous stewards, and as soon as possible should replace all essential detailees with staff aligned to the new president's priorities. The HSC has overseen pandemic response, and its incorporation is important. In the end, change requires intervention, and the NSC staff should be appropriately recruited, manned, and empowered to achieve the President's national security and foreign policy objectives and maintain robust policy analysis and discussion while minimizing resistance from those who have an agenda or who jealously guard their resources and autonomy at the expense of national security and sound policy development. This resistance and inertia can be inadvertently enabled by a small and unempowered NSC. Additionally, the White House Chief of Staff and NSA must ensure that the NSC is functioning in tandem with the rest of the White House staff to benefit from the best strategic thinking of the President's top advisors. History shows that an unsupervised NSC staff can stray from its statutory role and adversely affect a president and his policies. Moreover, while the NSC should be fully incorporated into the White House, it should also be allowed to do its job without the impediment of duly hatted staff that report to other offices. For instance, the NSC needs its own counsel to inform what legal options can be provided to the president. The White House counsel should be part of that policy process as the president's top legal advisor. These recommendations provide a clear roadmap for rapidly sizing and solidifying the NSC staff to support and achieve the president's objectives beginning on Inauguration Day. National Economic Council, NEC. The National Economic Council is one of the policy councils serving the president along with the NSC and the Domestic Policy Council, DPC. The director serves as principal advisor to the president on domestic and international economic policy and communicates the president's economic message to the media. The deputy director is responsible for the day-to-day operation of the council, which includes chairing the committee that coordinates economic policy development at the deputy secretary level. In effect, the director and deputy director are the officials who are primarily responsible for the development of economic policymaking for the administration. Once a policy is adopted, it is the appropriate agency's responsibility to implement it. The NEC's policy process is also used to determine whether the president should support or oppose legislation passed by Congress. In addition to its leadership, the NEC has policy experts, for example, special assistants to the president or SAPs, who are responsible for developing and coordinating, as well as advising the president on specific issues. It is essential that the policy expertise of the NEC reflect the current environment's most pressing issues. Today, this would include, among other topics, taxes, energy and environment, technology, infrastructure, healthcare, financial services, workforce, agriculture, antitrust and competition policy, and retirement programs. NEC's SAPs should have a working knowledge of how the administration can implement policy through the rulemaking process, although it is not necessary that they be experts on regulation themselves, particularly given OMB's role. This will facilitate the NEC's effectiveness in coordinating administration policy. The NEC needs to work closely with other offices within the Executive Office of the President to promote innovation by the private sector and create an environment that will stimulate economic activity while reducing federal spending and debt. This includes working with the DPC, NSC, OMB, Council of Economic Advisors, Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, Office of Cabinet Affairs, White House Council, Council on Environmental Quality, Office of Legislative Affairs, and Office of Science and Technology Policy. To this end, the NEC director should chair a standing meeting with the principals from each of the other EOP offices to enhance coordination from within the White House. In the past, there has been tension among the DPC, NEC, and NSC over jurisdiction. It is important to set clear jurisdictions at the start of an administration to prevent needless and counterproductive turf fights. In addition, the principal deputy for international economic policy is jointly appointed at NEC and NSC and could end up serving two different interests. To avoid such problems, international economic policy should be entirely coordinated from NEC. It will be especially important for the NEC to work seamlessly with the Council of Economic Advisors, CA, which provides the President and the White House offices with the latest economic data and forecasts, as well as estimates of the economic impact of proposed policies, and prepares the annual economic report of the President. The CEA is not a policy council and therefore does not run policy processes, which is the responsibility of the NEC, DPC, and NSC. However, the CEA does play a key role in ensuring that any policy considered by the councils is rigorously evaluated for its economic impacts. The NEC works closely with the White House Office of Communications and Office of Speechwriting to ensure that the White House's messaging and media engagement communicate the President's economic policy effectively. The NEC also plays a key role in advancing the President's economic agenda by advising the Office of Presidential Personnel on appointments to key economic posts, including positions in financial regulatory agencies. The NEC helps to ensure that each economic post is held by a person who shares the President's policy priorities and works well with the rest of the administration's economic team. The financial regulators are run partly by civil servants, some of whom were political appointees in prior liberal administrations, who often resist a conservative administration's policies. It is therefore critical that an administration not only appoints capable individuals to lead these agencies, but also has personnel who can be hired into senior staff positions within the agencies. A few areas will be especially important if the NEC is to develop a well-defined economic policy agenda. One is the promotion of innovation as a foundation for economic growth and opportunity. Another is the creation of an environment that fosters economic growth through tax reform and the elimination of regulatory and procedural barriers. Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative provides the President with the internal White House resources necessary to formulate and execute a unified, whole-of-government approach to trade policy. The President should ensure that the USTR is empowered to serve in that leadership role, much as other OP components organize and drive a coordinated policy agenda on behalf of the President. The People's Republic of China's predatory trade practices have disrupted the open market trading system that has provided mutual benefit to all participating countries, including China, for decades. The failure of the World Trade Organization, WTO, to discipline China for abrogation of its trading commitments has seriously undermined its credibility and made it a largely ineffective institution. The United States, through an empowered USTR, must act to rebalance and refocus international trading relationships in favor of democratic nations that embrace free, fair, and open trade principles built on market-driven economies. Chapter 26 of this book outlines recommended trade policy priorities for the incoming president. However, regardless of the approach, successful implementation of that trade agenda will require the President to articulate a clear policy direction and instructions for the executive branch to operate in a coordinated fashion under the leadership of an empowered USTR. To address these and other challenges, protect the American worker, and secure free and open markets for our communities and businesses, the next president must leverage the institutional resources and strength of the USTR, and neither allow institutional interests to drive a fragmented trade policy that is developed from the ground up nor cater to parochial interests across government and Washington's broader industry of influence. The USTR's mission is vitally important in reorienting the global trading system in a direction that is open, fair, and prosperous. In order to achieve the President's policy goals, a strong USTR must be empowered to set trade policy from the White House with the authority and resources to represent the interests of the President's trade agenda with adequate budget, staff, analysis, and expertise to engage meaningfully in internal and interagency policy deliberations. The USTR should organize and harness existing interagency trade committees to serve the President's trade agenda and drive a consensus among federal stakeholders, dispose of legacy advisory committees with members who serve special interests, direct action to implement policy priorities, measure progress toward implementing the President's agenda, and hold agencies and officials accountable for delivering the President's agenda. The USTR's leadership should not only coordinate and enforce the President's agenda across the federal community, but also set and enforce the President's trade agenda internally. Trade policy and priorities should be set by the President and implemented by the U.S. Trade Representative in cooperation with the other economic and national security officials, not by the range of governmental and non-governmental interests that attempt to force their policy preferences on the USTR. A strong USTR empowered with the necessary resources, authorities, and interagency cooperation will protect U.S. interests in the global marketplace more effectively. Council of Economic Advisors, CEA. Congress established the Council of Economic Advisors in 1946 to advise the President on economic policy based on data, research, and evidence. The CEA is one of the oldest congressionally created offices within the White House complex and plays a broad role in bringing economic expertise to administration policy across a large range of policy areas. The CEA has one presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed chair, two presidentially appointed members who assist and often have expertise that complements the chair, and approximately 40 staff employees. Statutorily, the CEA is charged with being the President's principal source of economic advice. However, this role has diminished over time as its policy appraisal and especially formulation and recommendation functions have been taken over or diluted by other economic policy bodies within the White House. By law, the CEA is required to publish an annual economic report of the President within 10 days after submission of the budget. This report is not just a messaging document. It is an opportunity to provide greater rigor in support of policy areas that the White House is prioritizing and to build up the external credibility of those ideas. A future conservative administration should utilize the CEA as the senior internal White House economists, much as the White House counsel's office functions as the senior internal White House lawyers. This does not mean that there are no economists in other offices. There are, just as there often are lawyers in the policy councils and other White House offices, but the CEA's role, like the White House councils, is to employ its unique expertise, particularly on the technical side, to ensure that sound analysis is contributing to and shaping the policy discussion. In practice, this means that CEA staff do not coordinate the policy process in the way that the DPC or NEC would, but they should be integral to the EOP's policy development processes. CEA staff should support sound policy development and execution by actively contributing to running policy dialogues, proactively raising issues that need to be addressed, consulting on questions that arise, and guiding EOP and agency officials on the analytical foundations of policy. Structurally, the White House Chief of Staff should ensure that the CEA has a seat at the policymaking table on all relevant policy. Senior economists traditionally have not gone through the Office of Presidential Personnel process and more often than not are hired on an academic year cycle. As a result, senior economists hired in the summer of a presidential election year tend to remain on staff until the next summer, even if a president from the opposite party takes power and installs a new slate of CA political appointees for chair, members, etc. Although these hiring practices create some continuity, the presence of senior economists who are never fully vetted for their alignment with White House policy objectives or who are holdovers from a recently departed administration can breed skepticism and distrust of the CA by other units within the White House, creating the risk that the CA's role in the policymaking process will be diminished. A future administration should consider hiring that reflects the White House calendar, mid-January, and involves the Office of Presidential Personnel. National Space Council, NSBC. The National Space Council is responsible for providing advice and recommendations to the President on the formulation and implementation of space policy and strategy. It is charged with conducting a whole-of-government approach to the nation's space interests, civil, military, intelligence, commercial, or diplomatic. Historically, it has been chaired by the Vice President at the President's direction, and its members consist of members of the Cabinet and other senior executive branch officials as specified by the President in Executive Order 13803. The NSBC's purpose is to ensure that the President's priorities relative to space are carried out and, as necessary, to resolve policy conflicts among departments and agencies that are related to space. Space projects and programs are risky, complex, expensive, and time-consuming, although commercial space innovations are lowering costs and accelerating schedules. Nevertheless, while fiscal discipline should not be ignored, long-term policy stability is crucial to investors, innovators, industry, and agencies. Policy stability is easier when policies and programs are aligned with long-term national interests as opposed to those of particular advocacy groups or political factions. The Trump administration's major space policies, including the U.S. Space Force, the Artemis program to land the next Americans on the moon, and support for a strong commercial space sector, have endured under the Biden administration. Major challenges remain in implementation and regulatory reform to keep up with rapidly evolving space markets and competitors. These include the long-term sustainability of space activities in light of increasing orbital debris, creation of space situational awareness services for civil and commercial uses, management of megaconstellations, licensing of new commercial remote sensing capabilities, keeping up with licensing demands due to high launch rates, transitioning international space station operations to multiple, privately owned space platforms, and, most important, accelerating the acquisition and fielding of national security space capabilities in response to an increasingly aggressive China. The Vice President should have a clear understanding with the National Security Advisor and the White House Counsel that they and their respective staffs will work within the White House to determine the scope and leadership of policy reviews that can overlap multiple areas of responsibility. A similar understanding is necessary with the heads of other policy councils such as the NEC, DPC, and National Science and Technology Council, NSTC. As a result of the President's direction and the Vice President's leadership, the NSBC under the Trump administration was able to coordinate a wide range of space policy reviews, legislative proposals, and regulatory reform smoothly. The NSBC generally led on space issues within the EOP, but other White House offices also took on space topics. As a member of the NSBC, and in coordination with other members, the Office of Science and Technology Policy developed a National Space Weather Strategy, Research and Development, R&D, plans to mitigate the effects of orbital debris, and protocols for planetary protection to avoid biological contamination of celestial bodies. The Council of Economic Advisors did research on the economic benefits of space property rights. OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Reform updated and streamlined commercial launch licensing and commercial remote sensing satellite rules. During the Trump administration, if a topic was purely military, such as standing up the U.S. Space Command, the NSC took the lead. If a topic cut across military, civil, and commercial sectors, as was the case with cybersecurity in space, the NSBC and NSC would co-chair the policy review groups. Trusted, collegial relationships across the White House complex are critical to successful space policy development, implementation, and oversight. Nowhere is this more important than in the relationship between the NSBC staff and OMB staff who oversee civil and national security-related space spending. Teamwork between the NSBC and OMB staff can communicate clear presidential priorities to departments and agencies, facilitating smooth development of the President's budget request. The NSBC and OMB have many opportunities to collaborate in promoting presidential priorities while finding offsets in lower priority programs and funding lines. Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, was created by the National Science and Technology Policy, Organization and Priorities Act of 1976. Before its creation, presidents received their advice and counsel on such matters through advisors and boards that had no statutory authority. The director of OSTP is one of the few Senate-confirmed positions within the Executive Office of the President. Consistent with other laws, the President may delegate to the director of OSTP directive authority over other elements of the executive branch. Other AOP policy officials and organizations, such as the NSC and NEC, are formally only advisory with relevant agency directives issued by the President. The OSTP's functions, as contained in the law, are to advise the President of scientific and technological considerations, evaluate the effectiveness of the federal effort, and generally lead and coordinate the federal government's R&D programs. If science is being manipulated at the agencies to support separate political and institutional agendas, the President should increase the prominence of the OSTP's director, either formally or informally. This would elevate the role of science in policy discussions and subsequent outcomes and theoretically help to balance out agencies like the Departments of Energy, State, and Commerce and the Environmental Protection Agency and Council on Environmental Quality. The OSTP can also help to bring technical expertise to regulatory matters in support of OMB. The OSTP should continue to play a lead role in coordinating federal R&D programs. Recent legislation, especially the CHIPS and Science Act 34, has expanded federal policy and funding across the enterprise, and there is a need for more significant leadership in this area, both to ensure effectiveness and to avoid duplication of effort. As befitting its location in the White House, the OSTP must be concerned with advancing national interests and not merely the parochial concerns of departments, agencies, or parts of the scientific community. During the Trump and Biden administrations, there has been a bipartisan focus on prioritizing R&D funding around the so-called industries of the future, ITF. Under President Trump, ITF priorities were artificial intelligence, AI, quantum information science, QS, advanced communications/5G, advanced manufacturing, and biotechnology. Under President Biden, this list has been expanded to include advanced materials, robotics, battery technology, cybersecurity, green products and clean technology, plant genetics and agricultural technologies, nanotechnology, and semiconductor and microelectronics technologies. These priorities should be evaluated and narrowed to ensure consistency with the next administration's priorities. Given a long list of priorities, coordinating efforts across agencies and measuring success are extremely challenging. The OSTP and OMB are required to work together on an annual basis to prioritize the funding requests and whatever Congress adds on top of them. But there continues to be concern about mission creep and funds expended on non-scientific R&D. The President should also issue an executive order to reshape the U.S. Global Change Research Program, USGCRP, and related climate change research programs. The USGCRP produces strategic plans and research, for example, the National Climate Assessment, that reduce the scope of legally proper options in presidential decision-making and in agency rulemakings and adjudications. Also, since much environmental policymaking must run the gauntlet of judicial review, USGCRP actions can frustrate successful litigation defense in ways that the career bureaucracy should not be permitted to control. The process for producing assessments should include diverse viewpoints. The OSTP and OMB should jointly assess the independence of the contractors used to conduct much of this outsourced government research that serves as the basis for policymaking. The next president should critically analyze and, if required, refuse to accept any USGCRP assessment prepared under the Biden administration. The president should also restore related EOP research components to their purely informational and advisory roles. Consistent with the Global Change Research Act of 1990, 35 US-CRP-related EOP components should be confined to a more limited advisory role. These components should include, but not necessarily be limited to, the OSTP, the NSTC's Committee on Environment, the USGCRP's interagency groups, for example, the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, and the Federal Coordinating Council for Science, Engineering, and Technology. As a general matter, the new administration should separate the scientific risk assessment function from the risk management function, which is the exclusive domain of elected policymakers and the public. Finally, the next administration will face a significant challenge in unwinding policies and procedures that are used to advance radical gender, racial, and equity initiatives under the banner of science. Similarly, the Biden administration's climate fanaticism will need a whole-of-government unwinding. As with other federal departments and agencies, the Biden administration's leveraging of the federal government's resources to further the woke agenda should be reversed and scrubbed from all policy manuals, guidance documents, and agendas. And scientific excellence and innovation should be restored as the OSTP's top priority. Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ. The Council on Environmental Quality is the EOP component with the principal task of administering the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, 36 by issuing regulations and interpretive documents and by overseeing the processes of individual permitting agencies' own NEPA regulations, including categorical exclusions. The CEQ also coordinates environmental policy across the federal government, and its influence has waxed and waned across administrations. The President should instruct the CEQ to rewrite its regulations implementing NEPA along the lines of the historic 2020 effort and restoring its key provisions, such as banning the use of cumulative impact analysis. This effort should incorporate new learning and more aggressive reform options that were not included in the 2020 reform package, with the overall goal of streamlining the process to build on the Supreme Court ruling that CEQ's interpretation of NEPA is entitled to substantial deference. 37. It should frame the new regulations to limit the scope for judicial review of agency NEPA analysis and judicial remedies. as well as to vindicate the strong public interest in effective and timely agency action. The Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, FISC, of which the CQ is a part, has been empowered by Congress through significant new funding and amendments to FAST 41. The President should build on this foundation to further empower the FISC by making its executive director an EOP appointee with delegated presidential directive authority over executive branch permitting agencies. For instance, the implementation of Executive Order 13807's 1 Federal Decision 39 revealed many ways that the systems established by EA 13807 can be improved. The new president should seek to issue a new executive order to create a unified process for major infrastructure projects that includes giving project proponents more control of any regulatory clocks. The president should issue an executive order establishing a senior advisor to coordinate the policy development and implementation of relevant energy and environment policy by officials across the EOP, for example, the policy staff of the NSC, NEC, DPC, CQ, and OSDP, and abolishing the existing Office of Domestic Climate Policy. The senior advisor would report directly to the Chief of Staff. The role would be similar to the role that Brian Dees and John Podesta had in the Obama White House. This energy/environment coordinator would help to lead the fight for sound energy and environment policies both domestically and internationally. The president should eliminate the Interagency Working Group on the Social Cost of Carbon, SCC, which is co-chaired by the OSDP, OMB, and CA, and by executive order should end the use of SCC analysis. Finally, the president should work with Congress to establish a sweeping modernization of the entire permitting system across all departments and agencies that is aimed at reducing litigation risk and giving agencies the authority to establish programmatic, general, and provisional permits. Office of National Drug Control Policy, OND. Congress created the Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, through the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 198,840 to serve as a coordinative auxiliary for the president on all matters related to drug policy. The next president's top drug policy priority must be to address the current fentanyl crisis and reduce the number of overdoses and fatalities. This crisis resulted in the deaths of more than 100,000 Americans in 2021. The next administration must reaffirm a commitment to preventing drug use before it starts, providing treatment that leads to long-term recovery, and reducing the availability of illicit drugs in the United States. The drug trafficking environment is exponentially more dynamic and dangerous today than it was just 5 years ago as powerful synthetic opioids, fentanyl and its analogs, are mixed into other drugs of abuse. Drug trafficking organizations are extremely nimble and able to adapt quickly to federal government actions and changes in user behavior. Disrupting the flow of drugs across our borders and into our communities is of paramount importance, both to save lives and to bolster our public health efforts. For these reasons, the director of ONDCP should make it a point to consult with federal border enforcement officials. The National Drug Control Program agencies represented a total of $41 billion in fiscal year 2022. Whereas the position for overseeing budget activities is traditionally held by a career official, it is imperative that a political appointee lead the ONDCP Budget Office to ensure coordination between the OMB Program Associate Director and the ONDCP Budgetary Appointee. ONDCP grant-making activities have been controversial over the years, particularly within conservative administrations concerned that the White House lacks the expertise to oversee such programs directly. The ONDCP administers 2 grant programs, the Drug-Free Communities Support Program and the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program. While it makes sense to transfer these programs eventually to the Department of Justice and Department of Health and Human Services, respectively, it is vital that the ONDCP director ensure in the immediate term that these grant programs are funding the president's drug control priorities and not woke nonprofits with leftist policy agendas. Thus, the president must ensure that the ONDCP is managed by political appointees who are committed to the administration's agenda and not acquiesce to management by political or career military personnel who oversaw the prior administration's ONDCP. Gender Policy Council, GPC. The president should immediately revoke Executive Order 140-2041 and every policy, including sub-regulatory guidance documents, produced on behalf of or related to the establishment or promotion of the Gender Policy Council and its subsidiary issues. Abolishing the Gender Policy Council would eliminate central promotion of abortion, health services, comprehensive sexuality education, and the new woke gender ideology, which has as a principal tenet gender-affirming care and sex change surgeries on minors. In addition to eliminating the council, developing new structures and positions will have the dual effect of demonstrating that promoting life and strengthening the family is a priority while also facilitating more seamless coordination and consistency across the U.S. government. Specifically, the president should appoint a position/point of contact with the rank of special assistant to the president or higher to coordinate and lead the president's domestic priorities on issues related to life and family in cooperation with the Domestic Policy Council. This position would be responsible for facilitating meetings, discussions, and agreements among personnel, coordinating administration policy, and ensuring agency support for implementation of policies related to the promotion of life and family in the United States. Office of the Vice President, OVP. The Vice President is elected to the second highest office in the nation and plays a constitutionally vital role as President-in-waiting. The Vice President is also the President of the Senate and is charged with breaking tie votes in that body. In recent years, the Vice President has been granted office space in the West Wing and the Eisenhower Executive Office building. The OFP is another one of the levers that the President should use to execute his agenda. This is particularly true because there is significant and unique leverage that the Vice President's leadership of the OFP can evoke to shape policy discussions and outcomes. Every other appointed White House official serves at the pleasure of the President, whereas the Vice President is elected, and the process for filling vacancies in that Article 2 constitutional office, which includes confirmation of a replacement Vice President by a majority of both houses of Congress, is governed by the 25th Amendment. The Vice President has his or her own economic advisors, domestic policy and national security staff, and daily intelligence briefings. The Vice President should fill his or her office with strong and sound policy minds to effectively assist the President in fulfilling his agenda. The Vice President is also a statutory member of the National Security Council. In theory, in light of the fact that the Vice President is a member of the Smithsonian Institution's Board of Regents, 44 there is nothing to prevent Congress from assigning the Vice President additional statutory duties. All of the component councils and offices discussed in this chapter include real policy development and implementation authority, and a robust OFP should be fully integrated into all policy formation procedures. Only a Vice President who is deeply steeped in the interworking of the interagency and policy councils can offer useful advice and prove helpful in accomplishing the President's agenda. It is also obvious, in view of the fact that many former Vice Presidents have gone on to be elected President in their own right, 45 that the Vice Presidency can act as a training ground for presidential office. In the past, the Vice President has been tasked with leading certain initiatives or issues. For example, Mike Pence was tasked with coordinating the federal response to COVID-19, and both Pence and Kamala Harris have chaired the National Space Council. Vice Presidents Richard Cheney and Dan Quayle were also active on the deregulatory front and in imposing regulatory moratoria. However, OFP officials should be fully integrated into each and every process from the start of a new administration and not have to wait to be invited to join various meetings or working groups on an ad hoc basis. For example, the budget and regulatory review processes are linchpins in the execution of policy, and the OFP should have a seat at the table through every phase of policy development. Past Vice Presidents have also spent significant time abroad serving as a type of brand ambassador for the White House and, more broadly, for the United States, announcing administration priorities and coordinating with heads of state and other top officials of foreign governments. The Vice President, as President of the Senate, often serves as a presidential emissary to the Senate and thus can be especially helpful in securing passage of the President's legislative agenda. To the extent that he or she desires, a Vice President can have a direct role in shaping administration policy. A Vice President who regularly attends meetings and disperses staff across the interagency and policy councils is a Vice President whose voice will be heard. Page 69. Central Personnel Agencies, Managing the Bureaucracy. Overview. From the very first mandate for leadership, the personnel is policy theme has been the fundamental principle guiding the government's personnel management. As the U.S. Constitution makes clear, the President's appointment, direction, and removal authorities are the central elements of his executive power. In implementing that power, the people and the President deserve the most talented and responsible workforce possible. Who the President assigns to design and implement his political policy agenda will determine whether he can carry out the responsibility given to him by the American people. The President must recognize that whoever holds a government position sets its policy. To fulfill an electoral mandate, he must therefore give personnel management his highest priority, including cabinet-level precedence. The federal government's immense bureaucracy spreads into hundreds of agencies and thousands of units, and is centered and overseen at the top by key central personnel agencies and their governing laws and regulations. The major separate personnel agencies in the national government today are the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, the Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, FLRA, and the Office of Special Counsel, OSC. Title V of the U.S. Code charges the OPM with executing, administering, and enforcing the rules, regulations, and laws governing the civil service. Point 2. It grants the OPM direct responsibility for activities like retirement, pay, health, training, federal unionization, suitability, and classification functions not specifically granted to other agencies by statute. Ions of service, tenure, and separation of employees. The MSPB is the lead adjudicator for hearing and resolving cases and controversies for 2.2 million federal employees. It is required to conduct fair and neutral case adjudications, regulatory reviews, and actions and studies to improve the workforce. Its court-like adjudications investigate and hear appeals from agency actions such as furloughs, suspensions, demotions, and terminations, and are appealable to the U.S. Court of Appeals. The FLRA hears appeals of agency personnel cases involving federal labor grievance procedures to provide judicial review with binding decisions appealable to appeals courts. It interprets the rights and duties of agencies and employee labor organizations on management rights, OPM interpretations, recognition of labor organizations, and unfair labor practices, under the general principle of bargaining in good faith and compelling need. The OSC serves as the investigator, mediator, publisher, and prosecutor before the MSPB with respect to agency and employees regarding prohibited personnel practices, Hatch Act 5 politicization, Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act 6 issues, and whistleblower complaints. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, has general responsibility for reviewing charges of employee discrimination against all civil rights breaches. However, it also administers a government employee section that investigates and adjudicates federal employee complaints concerning equal employment violations as with the private sector. This makes the agency an additional de facto factor in government personnel management. While not a personnel agency per se, the General Services Administration, GSA, is charged with general supervision of contracting. Today, there are many more contractors in government than there are civil service employees. The GSA must therefore be a part of any personnel management discussion. Analysis and recommendations. OPM, managing the federal bureaucracy. At the very pinnacle of the modern progressive program to make government competent stands the ideal of professionalized, career civil service. Since the turn of the 20th century, progressives have sought a system that could effectively select, train, reward, and guard from partisan influence the neutral scientific experts they believe are required to staff the national government and run the administrative state. Their U.S. system was initiated by the Pendleton Act of 188,310 and institutionalized by the 1930s New Deal to set principles and practices that were meant to ensure that expert merit rather than partisan favors or personal favoritism ruled within the federal bureaucracy. Yet, as public frustration with the civil service has grown, generating calls to drain the swamp, it has become clear that their project has had serious unintended consequences. The civil service was devised to replace the amateurism and presumed corruption of the old spoils system, wherein government jobs rewarded loyal partisans who might or might not have professional backgrounds. Although the system appeared to be sufficient for the nation's first century, progressive intellectuals and activists demanded a more professionalized, scientific, and politically neutral administration. Progressives designed a merit system to promote expertise and shield bureaucrats from partisan political pressure, but it soon began to insulate civil servants from accountability. The modern merit system increasingly made it almost impossible to fire all but the most incompetent civil servants. Complying with arcane rules regarding recruiting, rating, hiring, and firing simply replaced the goal of cultivating competence and expertise. In the 1970s, Georgia Democratic Governor Jimmy Carter, then a political unknown, ran for president supporting New Deal programs and their Great Society expansion, but opposing the way they were being administered. The policies were not actually reducing poverty, increasing prosperity, or improving the environment, he argued, and to make them work required fundamental bureaucratic reform. White charged that almost all government employees were rated as successful, all received the same pay regardless of performance, and even the worst were impossible to fire, and he won the presidency. President Carter fulfilled his campaign promise by hiring Syracuse University Dean Alan Campbell, who served first as chairman of the U.S. Civil Service Commission and then as director of the OPM and helped him devise and pass the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, CSRA 11, to reset the basic structure of today's bureaucracy. A new performance appraisal system was devised with a 5 rather than 3 distribution of rating categories and individual goals more related to agency missions and more related to employee promotion for all. Pay and benefits were based directly on improved performance appraisals, including sizable bonuses, for mid-level managers and senior executives. But time ran out on President Carter before the act could be fully executed, so it was left to President Ronald Reagan and his new OPM and agency leadership to implement. Overall, the new law seemed to work for a few years under Reagan, but the Carter-Reagan reforms were dissipated within a decade. Today, employee evaluation is back to pre-reform levels with almost all rated successful or above, frustrating any relation between pay and performance. An outstanding rating should be required for senior executive service, SES, chiefs to win big bonuses, but a few years ago, when it was disclosed that the Veterans Administration executives who encouraged false reporting of waiting lists for hospital admission were rated outstanding, the Senior Executive Association justified it, telling Congress that only outstanding performers would be promoted to the SES in the first place, and that precise ratings were unnecessary. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, however, has reported that pay raises, within-grade pay increases, and locality pay for regular employees and executives have become automatic rather than based on performance, as a result of most employees being rated at similar appraisal levels. Then for a large national government to hire good people through merit selection. The government did so for years, but it has proven difficult in recent times to select personnel based on their knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSA, as the law dictates. Yet for the past 34 years, the U.S. civil service has been unable to distinguish consistently between strong and unqualified applicants for employment. As the Carter presidency was winding down, the U.S. Department of Justice and top lawyers at the OPM contrived with plaintiffs to end civil service IQ examinations because of concern about their possible impact on minorities. The OPM had used the Professional and Administrative Career Examination, PACE, General Intelligence Exam to select college graduates for top agency employment, but Carter administration officials, probably without the president's informed concurrence, abolished the PACE through a legal consent court decree capitulating to demands by civil rights petitioners who contended that it was discriminatory. The judicial decree was to last only 5 years, but still controls federal hiring and is applied to all KSA tests even today. General ability tests like the PACE have been used successfully to assess the usefulness and cost-effectiveness of broad intellectual qualities across many separate occupations. Courts have ruled that even without evidence of overt, intentional discrimination, such results might suggest discrimination. This doctrine of disparate impact could be ended legislatively or at least narrowed through the regulatory process by a future administration. In any event, the federal government has been denied the use of a rigorous entry examination for 3 decades, relying instead on self-evaluations that have forced managers to resort to subterfuge such as pre-selecting friends or associates that they believe are competent to obtain qualified employees. In 2015, President Barack Obama's OPM began to introduce an improved merit examination called USA Hire, which it had been testing quietly since 2012 in a few agencies for a dozen job descriptions. Why replies, questions that would change regularly to depress cheating. President Donald Trump's OPM planned to implement such changes, but was delayed because of legal concerns over possible disparate impact. Courts have agreed to review the consent decree if the uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures setting the technical requirements for sound exams are reformed. A government that is unable to select employees based on KSA-like test qualifications cannot work, and the OPM must move forward on this very basic personnel management obligation. The centrality of performance appraisal. In the meantime, the OPM must manage the workforce it has. Before they can reward or discipline federal employees, managers must first identify who their top performers are and who is performing less than adequately. In fact, as Ludwig von Mises proved in his classic Bureaucracy, unlike the profit and loss evaluation tool used in the private sector, government performance measurement depends totally on a functioning appraisal system. If they cannot be identified in the first place within a functioning appraisal system, it is impossible to reward good performance or correct poor performance. The problem is that the collegial atmosphere of a bureaucracy in a multifaceted appraisal system that is open to appeals makes this a very challenging ideal to implement successfully. The GAO reported more recently that overly high and widely spread performance ratings were again plaguing the government, with more than 99% of employees rated fully successful or above by their managers, a mere 0.3% rated as minimally successful, and 0.1% actually rated unacceptable. Why? It is human nature that no one appreciates being told that he or she is less than outstanding in every way. Informing subordinates in a closely knit bureaucracy that they are not performing well is difficult. Rating compatriots is even considered rude and unprofessional. Moreover, managers can be and often are accused of racial or sexual discrimination for a poor rating, and this discourages honesty. 138-3916 requiring agencies to reduce the time for employees to improve performance before corrective action could be taken, to initiate disciplinary actions against poorly performing employees more expeditiously, to reiterate that agencies are obligated to make employees improve, to reduce the time for employees to respond to allegations of poor performance, to mandate that agencies remind supervisors of expiring employee probationary periods, to prohibit agencies from entering into settlement agreements that modify an employee's personnel record, and to reevaluate procedures for agencies to discipline supervisors who retaliate against whistleblowers. Unfortunately, the order was overturned by the Biden administration, so it will need to be reintroduced in 2025. The fact remains that meaningfully evaluating employees' performance is a critical part of a manager's job. In the Reagan appraisal process, managers were evaluated on how they themselves rated their subordinates. This is critical to responsibility and improved management. It is essential that political executives build policy goals directly into employee appraisals both for mission success and for employees to know what is expected. Indistinguishable from their coworkers on paper, hardworking federal employees often go unrewarded for their efforts and are often the system's greatest critics. Federal workers who are performing inadequately get neither the benefit of an honest appraisal nor clear guidance on how to improve. Political executives should take an active role in supervising performance appraisals of career staff, not unduly delegate this responsibility to senior career managers, and be willing to reward and support good performers. Merit pay. Performance appraisal means little to daily operations if it is not tied directly to real consequences for success as well as failure. According to a survey of major U.S. private companies, which, unlike the federal government, also have a profit and loss evaluation, 90% use a system of merit pay for performance based on some type of appraisal system. Despite early efforts to institute merit pay throughout the federal government, however, compensation is still based primarily on seniority rather than merit. TTS of merit pay for performance based on some type of appraisal system. Despite early efforts to institute merit pay throughout the federal government, however, compensation is still based primarily on seniority rather than merit. Merit pay for executives and managers was part of the Carter reforms and was implemented early in the Reagan presidency. Beginning in the summer of 1982, the Reagan OPM entered 18 months of negotiations with House and Senate staff on extending merit pay to the entire workforce. Long and detailed talks between the OPM and both Democrats and Republicans in Congress ensued, and a final agreement was reached in 1983 that supposedly ensured the passage of legislation creating a new performance management and recognition system, PMRS, for all, not just management, GS 13 through GS 15 employees. Meanwhile, the OPM issued regulations to expand the role of performance related to pay throughout the entire workforce, but congressional allies of the employee unions, led by Representative Steny Hoyer, D. of Government Employee, Rich, Maryland, stoutly resisted this extension of pay for performance and, with strong union support, used the congressional appropriations process to block OPM administrative pay reforms. Bonuses for SS career employees survived, but performance appraisals became so high and widely distributed that there was little relationship between performance and remuneration. Ever since the original merit pay system for federal managers, GM 13 through GM 15 grade levels, just below the SES, was allowed to expire in September 1993, little to nothing has been done either to reinstate the federal merit pay program for managers or to distribute performance rating evaluations for the SES, much less to extend the program to the remainder of the workforce. ARD strategically to reward good performance to the degree allowed by law, making the appeals process work. The non-military government dismissal rate is well below 1%, and no private sector industry employee enjoys the job security that a federal employee enjoys. Both safety and justice demand that managers learn to act strategically to hire good and fire poor performers legally. The initial paperwork required to separate poor or abusive performers, when they are infrequently identified, is not overwhelming, and managers might be motivated to act if it were not for the appeals and enforcement processes. Formal appeal in the private sector is mostly a rather simple two-step process, but government unions and associations have been able to convince politicians to support a multiple and extensive appeals and enforcement process. As noted, there are multiple administrative appeals bodies. The FLRA, OSC, and EOC have relatively narrow jurisdictions. Claims that an employee's removal or disciplinary actions violate the terms of a collective bargaining agreement between an agency and a union are handled by the FLRA. Employees who claim their removal was the result of discrimination can appeal to the EOC, and employees who believe their firing was retribution for being a whistleblower can go to the OSC. While the MSPB specializes in abuses of direct merit system issues, it can and does hear and review almost any of the matters heard by the other agencies. Cases involving race, gender, religion, age, pregnancy, disability, or national origin can be appealed to the EOC or the MSPB, and in some cases to both, and to the OSC. This gives employees multiple opportunities to prove their cases, and while the EOC, MSPB, FLRA, and OSC may all apply essentially the same burden of proof, the odds of success may be substantially different in each forum. In fact, forum shopping among them for a friendlier venue is a common practice, but frequent filers face no consequences for frivolous complaints. The odds of success may be substantially different in each forum. In fact, forum shopping among them for a friendlier venue is a common practice, but frequent filers face no consequences for frivolous complaints. As a result, meritorious cases are frequently delayed, denying relief and justice to truly aggrieved individuals. The MSPB can and does handle all such matters, but it faces a backlog of an estimated 3,000 cases of people who were potentially wrongfully terminated or disciplined as far back as 2013. From 2017 to 2022, the MSPB lacked the quorum required to decide appeals. On the other hand, as of January 2023, the EOC had a backlog of 42,000 cases. While federal employees win appeals relatively infrequently, MSPB administrative judges have upheld agency decisions as much as 80% of the time. The real problem is the time and paperwork involved in the elaborate process that managers must undergo during appeals. This keeps even the best managers from bringing cases in all but the most egregious cases of poor performance or misconduct. As a result, the MSPB, EOC, FLRA, and OSC likely see very few cases compared to the number of occurrences, and non-performers continue to be paid and often are placed in non-work positions. Having a choice of appeals is especially unique to the government. If lower priority issues were addressed in-house, serious adverse actions would be less subject to delay. With the proper limitation of labor union actions, the FLRA should have limited reason for appeals. The EOC's federal employee section should be transferred to the MSPB, and many of the OCS's investigatory functions should be returned to the OPM. The MSPB could then become the main reviewer of adverse actions, greatly simplifying the burdensome appeal process, making civil service benefits economically and administratively rational. In recent years, the combined wages and benefits of the executive branch civilian workforce totaled $300 billion according to official data. But even that amount does not properly account for billions in unfunded liability for retirement and other government reporting distortions. Properly account for billions in unfunded liability for retirement and other government reporting distortions. Official data also report employment as approximately 2 million, but this ignores approximately 20 million contractors who, while not eligible for government pay and benefits, do receive them indirectly through contracting, even if they are less generous. Official data also claim that national government employees are paid less than private sector employees are paid for similar work, but several more neutral sources demonstrate that public sector workers make more on average than their private sector counterparts. All of this extravagance deserves close scrutiny. Market-based pay and benefits. According to current law, federal workers are to be paid wages comparable to equivalent private sector workers rather than compared to all private sector employees. While the official studies claim that federal employees are underpaid relative to the private sector by 20% or more, a 2016 Heritage Foundation study found that federal employees received wages that were 22% higher than wages for similar private sector workers if the value of employee benefits was included. The total compensation premium for federal employees over their private sector equivalents increased to between 30% and 40%. The American Enterprise Institute found a 14% pay premium and a 61% total compensation premium. Base salary is only one component of a federal employee's total compensation. In addition to high starting wages, federal employees normally receive an annual cost of living adjustment, available to all employees, and generous scheduled raises known as step increases. Moreover, a large proportion of federal employees are stationed in the Washington, D.C. area and other large cities and are entitled to steep locality pay enhancement to account for the high cost of living in these areas. A federal employee with 5 years' experience receives 20 vacation days, 13 paid sick days, and all 10 federal holidays compared to an employee at a large private company who receives 13 days of vacation and 8 paid sick days. And all 10 federal holidays compared to an employee at a large private company who receives 13 days of vacation and 8 paid sick days. Federal health benefits are more comparable to those provided by Fortune 500 employers, with the government paying 72% of the weighted average premiums, but this is much higher than for most private plans. Almost half of private firms do not offer any employer contributions at all. The obvious solution to these discrepancies is to move closer to a market model for federal pay and benefits. One need is for a neutral agency to oversee pay hiring decisions, especially for high-demand occupations. The OPM is independent of agency operations, so it can assess requirements more neutrally. For many years, with its special pay rates program, the OPM evaluated claims that federal rates in an area were too low to attract competent employees and allowed agencies to offer higher pay when needed rather than increased rates for all. Ideally, the OPM should establish an initial pay schedule for every occupation and region, monitor turnover rates and applicant-to-position ratios, and adjust pay and recruitment on that basis. Most of this requires legislation, but the OPM should be an advocate for a true equality of benefits between the public and private sectors. Reforming federal retirement benefits. Career civil servants enjoy retirement benefits that are nearly unheard of in the private sector. Federal employees retire earlier, normally at age 55 after 30 years, enjoy richer pension annuities, and receive automatic cost of living adjustments based on the areas in which they retire. Defined benefit federal pensions are fully indexed for inflation, a practice that is extremely rare in the private sector. A federal employee with a pre-retirement income of $25,000 under the older of the two federal retirement plans will receive at least $200,000 more over a 20-year period than will private sector workers with the same pre-retirement salary under historic inflation levels. During the early Reagan years, the OPM reformed many specific provisions of the federal pension program to save billions administratively. Under OPM pressure, Reagan and Congress ultimately ended the old Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS, entirely for new employees, which, counting disbursements for the unfunded liability, accounted for 51.3% of the federal government's total payroll. The retirement system that replaced it, the Federal Employees Retirement System, FERS, reduced the cost of federal employee retirement disbursements to 28.5% of payroll, including contributions to Social Security and the employer match to the Thrift Savings Plan. More of the pension cost was shifted to the employee, but the new system was much more equitable for the 40% who received few or no benefits under the old system. By 1999, more than half of the federal workforce was covered by the new system, and the government's per capita share of the cost, as the employer, was less than half the cost of the old system. 20.2% of FERS payroll versus 44.3% of CSRS payroll, representing one of the largest examples of government savings anywhere. Although the government pension system has become more like private pension systems, it still remains much more generous, and other means might be considered in the future to move it even closer to private plans. GSA. Landlord and Contractor Management. The General Services Administration is best known as the federal government's landlord, designing, constructing, managing, and preserving government buildings and leasing and managing outside commercial real estate, contracting with 376.9 million square feet of space. Obviously, as its prime function, real estate expertise is key to the GSA's success. However, the GSA is also the government's purchasing agent, connecting federal purchasers with commercial products and services in the private sector and their personnel management functions. With contractors performing so many functions today, the GSA therefore becomes a de facto part of government-wide personnel management. The GSA also manages the Presidential Transition Act, PTA, process, which also directly involves the OPM. A recent proposal would have incorporated the OPM and GSA and OMB. Fortunately, this did not take place in that form. But it would make sense for GSA and OPM leadership and staff to hold regular meetings to work through matters of common interest such as moderating PTA personnel restrictions and the relationships between contract and civil service employees. Reductions in force. Reducing the number of federal employees seems an obvious way to reduce the overall expense of the civil service, and many prior administrations have attempted to do just this. Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama began their terms, as did Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, by mandating a freeze on the hiring of new federal employees. But these efforts did not lead to permanent and substantive reductions in the number of non-defense federal employees. First, it is a challenge even to know which workers to cut. As mentioned, there are 2 million federal employees, but since budgets have exploded, so has the total number of personnel with nearly 10 times more federal contractors than federal employees. Contractors are less expensive because they are not entitled to high government pensions or benefits and are easier to fire and discipline. Easier to fire and discipline. In addition, millions of state government employees work under federal grants, in effect administering federal programs. These cannot be cut directly. Cutting federal employment can be helpful and can provide a simple story to average citizens, but cutting functions, levels, funds, and grants is much more important than setting simple employment size. Simply reducing numbers can actually increase costs. OMB instructions following President Trump's employment freeze told agencies to consider buyout programs, encouraging early retirements in order to shift costs from current budgets in agencies to the retirement system and minimize the number of personnel fired. The Environmental Protection Agency immediately implemented such a program, and OMB urged the passage of legislation to increase payout maximums from $25,000 to $40,000 to further increase spending under the cuts. President Clinton's OMB had introduced a similar buyout that cost the Treasury $2.8 billion, mostly for those who were going to retire anyway. Moreover, when a new employee is hired to fill a job recently vacated in a buyout, the government for a time is paying 2 people to fill 1 job. What is needed at the beginning is a freeze on all top career position hiring to prevent burrowing in by outgoing political appointees. Moreover, 4 factors determine the order in which employees are protected during layoffs: tenure, veterans' preference, seniority, and performance in that order of importance. Despite several attempts in the House of Representatives during the Trump years to enact legislation that would modestly increase the weight given to performance over time of service, the fierce opposition by federal managers associations and unions representing long-serving, but not necessarily well-performing constituents explains why the bills failed to advance. A determined president should insist that performance be first and be wary of costly types of reductions in force. Impenetrable bureaucracy. Congress could take to improve efficiency and effectiveness across 37 areas that span a broad range of government missions and functions. It identified 33 actions to address mission fragmentation, overlap, and duplication in the 12 areas of defense, economic development, health, homeland security, and information technology. It also identified 59 other opportunities for executive agencies or Congress to reduce the cost of government operations or enhance revenue collection across 25 areas of government. A logical place to begin would be to identify and eliminate functions and programs that are duplicated across cabinet departments or spread across multiple agencies. Congress hoped to help this effort by passing the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993-21, which required all federal agencies to define their missions, establish goals and objectives, and measure and report their performance to Congress. 3 decades of endless time-consuming reports later, the government continues to grow, but with more paper and little change either in performance or in the number of levels between government and the people. The Brookings Institution's Paul Light emphasizes the importance of the increasing number of levels between the top heads of departments and the people at the bottom who receive the products of government decision-making. He estimates that there are perhaps 50 or more levels of impenetrable bureaucracy and no way other than imperfect performance appraisals to communicate between them. The Trump administration proposed some possible consolidations, but these were not received favorably in Congress, whose approval is necessary for most such proposals. The best solution is to cut functions and budgets and devolve responsibilities. That is a challenge primarily for presidents, Congress, and the entire government, but the OPM still needs to lead the way government-wide in managing personnel properly, even in any future smaller government. Creating a responsible career management service.